Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. The Jubilee is coming. Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, honored guests. I'm not talking about the July Jubilee, although that is coming. I'm talking about the Debt Jubilee for America. Yes, the Debt Jubilee is coming. What, you may wonder, is a Debt Jubilee? Well, it's simply this. It's an idea that's thousands of years old. It was mentioned in the Bible. In ancient Israel, every 50 years, all debts would be eliminated. And believe it or not, it's happened before in this country. So, what happens in a debt jubilee? Well, first of all the debts are reduced. Millions of people will be looking forward to our debt jubilee. Politicians will announce a new prosperity. But that's not what really happens. What really happens is a lot of chaos. Now, a couple things are required for a debt jubilee. The first is a wide disparity between the richest and the rest of us. The second is an ineffective government. Do we have those? Well, let's find out. Another word for debt jubilee is populism. Populism in the 20th century, had its rise in the 1930s. And guess what? That's what we have now. We've had in the last few years a steep rise in populism. What is populism? It means that people are angry against the elites. They're angry against their government. And this is not a phenomenon unique to America. It's happening worldwide. What happens just before a debt jubilee? Well, interest rates go to zero. Take a look at the 1930s and compare to just recently. Our interest rates were very close to zero in this country. I'm talking about the Federal Reserve interest rate, which controls all the interest rates in the country. What do people do? What do governments do when there's a problem? Well, the first thing they do is they have something called deleveraging of the money. In other words, they print more money. They spread it out. That's what happened in 2009, very similar to what happened in the 1930s. The government has printed a lot of money, only today the government doesn't need to print it. They can do it on computer. You can see what's happened. Even today, it's higher than what it was in the 30s. What happens? Basically, what happened in the 1930s is you had a big runoff in stocks. You had a stock market collapse, creating the Depression. But yet, from 1933 to 1937, there was, in fact, a stock market rally, 350% off its lows. What's happened to our stock market? In 2009, we had a crash of the stock market. And since then, we've had a 250% rally off the bottom of that market. History seems to be repeating itself. What about income shares? Back in the 1930s, the richest 10% of citizens in this country had about just under 50%, typically more like 45% of the wealth in this country. Today, the richest 10% own a bit more than 50% of the wealth in this country. So we have income disparity. And we have some culture problems. We've had more foreign-born people in this country now since we've had in the 1930s, and this creates cultural conflict. But the problem is not the fact that people are getting rich. The rich get rich. It's how they got rich is the problem. Here's the problem. You can see since 1980, we've had a lot of productivity. The economy has grown. But where has the money gone? It's gone to the very high-wage people. It's gone to corporate profits. 41% increase since 1980 in terms of purchasing power. What about you, the working stiff, the middle-wage people? Well, you've had a 6% increase since 1980. Consider that fact for a minute. What if your boss told you, working 34 years in a row, your raise this year is going to be just under 0.002%? how would you feel? I think you'd feel a lot like a lot of people feel today. And look at the worst. The lowest wage people are actually 4% down from the purchasing power they had in 1980. Why is all this so? Because there's been a lot of debt. Over the last 10 years, government debt has more than doubled. Corporate debt has increased. Household debt has increased. Now consider this. Student debt in America. This is a staggering graph. $1.5 trillion in student debt. Most of the students will never be able to pay this off. And that's what causes a July Jubilee. I'm sorry, a debt jubilee. What happens to shape a debt jubilee is simply this. Debt goes up, debt service goes up. The service of the debt goes up faster than the income. Eventually you reach a point where there's a realization the debt will never be paid. And a jubilee is required. So here's the secret. The underlying cause of wealth and income disparity in America is simply this. Wages are no longer connected to gains in productivity. Consider history. Henry Ford started the production line for automobiles. That made the automobile easier to afford. So that was a huge gain in productivity, and Henry Ford shared it with his workers. In 1914, he doubled the minimum wage of his workers overnight. And that's the way it's gone in America for most of its time. Every time there was a gain in productivity, and there has been, workers' wage increased along with it, and the standard of living increased. But what happened? Around 1973, that changed. All of a sudden, workers who increased productivity didn't get the benefits. It went to corporate profits and the richest people. Why? Take a look at the Ford F-150 series, the most popular truck in America, has been for decades. In 1970, you could get one for $2,500. Now you could get a base model for more than $30,000, but nobody drives the base. Something you're going to drive is $45,000. So the next big crisis is underway. People are getting angry on both sides of the political spectrum. This is a picture of what happened in Charlottesville last year. And now we're looking at the American Jubilee. The Jubilee is actually something that's gone worldwide. Croatia had one in 2015. Japan now has a Jubilee on half its national debt. Even President Trump proposed a Jubilee on Puerto Rican bonds after Hurricane Maria. Take a look at the Croatian stock index. It's gone down since their Jubilee. We have a presidential election in 2020, 49 years to the day of the last American Jubilee. Since then, total debt has risen from 100% of GDP to 400%. So America's debt jubilee will be like that in 1841. $1.5 trillion of student debt will be reduced because there are more millennials now than baby boomers. Millions of investors will lose everything. Stocks will collapse. Dozens of companies bankrupted. Every American will be affected. Now, how do you solve this? How do you protect your own family's assets? Well, 2 weeks ago, my evaluator said, leave them wanting your next speech. So if a majority of people ask for the follow-on solutions in your evaluations, there will be a follow-on speech. Mr. Toastmaster.